From Bay News 9, the latest breaking news, county by county coverage, plus weather on the nines. This is your Midday News Weather Now.
Joining me right now is Cathy Beveridge, who is a labor attorney, as we continue our discussion about the minimum wage. Okay, first of all, when we're talking about the minimum wage, does anybody think that these businesses, if the minimum wage is up to $10.10, won't pass this on to consumers? I mean, where are they going to get the money?
I think at some point in time, most costs of business do get passed along to consumers. I'm sure some businesses will try to keep their product line the exact same price, and they may cut back on employees as possible.
Maybe you can address this. Compared to where we were 20 years ago with what the minimum wage was, where are we now in terms of what the dollar buys now versus what it bought 20 years ago? Because some people say the reason for a need of a minimum wage increase is that it just isn't equal to what it was 20 years ago.
Well, I look at it from a salary perspective, because that's the other thing that the president's been talking about lately, has been that $455 a week for salaried employees. Back in 1970, that was $75, it was increased to $250 a week, and the $455 has not kept pace with inflation on that. Even when we changed that in 2004 to $455, we're looking at $561 a week in today's dollars. So
what that means is, in other words, the overtime rules wouldn't apply to you if they said to you, hey, you're in management and you're making right now $23,000, but you make $1 more than that and then you don't get overtime. I didn't know about that.
Except it's not supposed to be as easy as putting a label of you're in management. They're also supposed to be management duties. So the label's not supposed to be enough. It's really supposed to be the focus on the duties.
You know, it's amazing to me that how, I don't want to use the words fudge, but how closely people will follow the law and the intent of the law to try to reduce costs.
Well, I represent companies, so when we look at the law, we'll follow the law. But from our perspective, what we're thinking about is if you've got someone who is the person running a location for a business, they're managing 7 or 8 employees. They're the person who is in charge of hiring and firing. They tell somebody what to do. The big issue that's come up lately with what the president has been looking at is that person a manager if they also work alongside other employees? I'm biased. I work on companies' behalf, so I would argue that if they're the person hiring and firing, they're directing what somebody does on a day-in, day-out basis. If they also work alongside an employee, they're a manager, and they should be exempt.
And they don't get overtime, but that almost doesn't make sense because they're doing just as much work as the person that does overtime, right?
And the idea was supposed to be that someone would get more money from a guaranteed basis. There are things that come with a salary. For example, you're not supposed to make deductions. If somebody takes a part day off, they don't get their salary reduced, like an hour employee wouldn't get paid for the 4 hours they missed.
So is the president proposing that this change, we go to a higher figure than $455 a week?
The president hasn't said anything specifically other than the intent is to simplify the regulations, streamline them, and modernize them. I think modernize means raise that $455 a week to keep pace with inflation. California, for example, has a higher, right now I think it's $760 a week in California to be salaried. It's going to change it to, I think, $820 July 1st, and by 2016 it's going to be actually $800 by 2016. So they're already higher, and that may be a reflection of geography, but it's also a reflection of inflation.
But here's the thing, most of us think in our heads, whether it's right and wrong, you work more than 8 hours, you get time and a half. You work more than 40 hours, you should get time and a half. But in reality, how often is that happening in the workplace? Most of the time? Part of the time?
The idea would be, in my example of, you've got a store of 7 or 8 people, one of them is the exempt manager and the other 7 are getting time and a half after 40.
Yeah, and lastly, because one of this is it's a 4-pronged attack the president has, and one of the things he wants to talk about is trying to have equal pay for equal work, particularly targeting the women voters, you might say, because a lot of people will say that's why he's doing this. But is that what's going on right now? I thought there were equal pay provisions in the law right now.
There are. There is an Equal Pay Act that already talks about if there's equal work, the pay should be equal regardless of your gender. There are questions about how that's applied. Have wages for women really kept up with that? But the law's there. It may be a question of application and how people are looking at it. But from my perspective, I don't know that we really need another law when we already have one on the books. If somebody wants to talk about changing it or enforcing it.
So then you would take exception to what the president said?
From the standpoint of, I would take exception at that there's not a law already in this area.
Okay.
I wouldn't take exception with the idea as a woman.
Oh, yeah.
The equal pay for equal work.
Well, I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. That should be taking place right now. Interesting to see where this is all going to go. Cathy, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
You're welcome, Al. Thank you.
Now, the president is also calling on Congress to raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to $10.10. Earlier this month, he signed an executive order giving that raise to federal workers. And by the way, we're also told that nearly 90% of all the labor complaints in the state of Florida are over, you guessed it, overtime. And that's it for today's In Depth. Remember, you can see this and past In Depths on demand on channel 999.